Okay, so what we are looking at is culture and development. So we're going to look at how culture influences human development. And we're going to start with some definitions and how cross-cultural psychologists go about researching the differences and similarities or universalities of human development when they're looking across cultures. And then we're going to make some general comments about parenting styles and about cognitive development, or how we develop our ability to reason and think and make decisions across a lifespan, starting with infancy through childhood. So that's kind of our goal for today. So the thing that we need to start off with is that the study of human development, which can be basically defined as how people change psychologically, biologically, and socio-emotionally over time, has traditionally been studied with what's called a Eurocentric developmental process. And the term that is kind of used for this is the term weird, in that we have to understand that the models that we're going to use to compare different um, cultures is going to come from what we call weird societies. And weird societies are considered W for Western, meaning that European kind of United States perspective, specifically from Western Europe and the United States. Educated, and I want to qualify the term educated based upon Western standards, meaning that the majority have went through elementary, junior high, and high school. Many of them have a Western college or university degree. It's not necessarily meaning educated in the specific environment in which someone is raised. Industrial means that they've gone through the Industrial Revolution. They have these countries have the modern commodities of homes and refrigeration and plumbing and technology, for that matter, electricity, all of those amenities of being an independent individuals. The other aspect is rich, meaning that they have economic wealth when compared to other types of societies. And democratic, meaning that there is kind of this freedom of choice, that the majority rules, that life is not determined by some dictator or some dogmatic philosophy, but people have the ability to make decisions and put their voice into that society. Okay. And it is also important at this point to say that it's only been about the last 50 years. Now we can trace anthropological studies and other fields of studies that have looked across cultures much longer, but within the field of psychology, um, it's only been about the last 50 years, maybe 60 years, where a cross-cultural approach has been taken seriously. And the reason why it has been taken seriously is that one of the main goals of psychology is to figure out what psychological mechanisms are universal, meaning that they apply to someone living here in southern Arizona, as well as someone who is living in Iraq versus someone who's living in Taiwan. What are those universal rules or laws on a psychological basis that go across cultures? The other thing that cross-cultural approach about 50, 60 years wanted to know is, how does culture influence someone's psychological, social, and physical development? So So what are the similarities across cultures, but what also makes culture, what makes individuals from different cultures unique in their developmental processes. So just to kind of give this a little bit more clear definition, and I'll put this presentation on Canvas, is really when we're talking about this, uh, cross-cultural development is a study of the relationship between cultural context and human development and the behaviors that become established in the repertoire of individuals growing up in a particular culture. And on top of that, and I'll just read this again, culture similarities and differences in developmental processes and their outcomes as they're expressed by behaviors in individuals and groups. So just as we talked about in that previous slide, these definitions express that we're looking about what are the universal things about development? What makes the human race one race as an example? Okay. But then what are the unique cultural um, uh, processes that make it so a person can be adapted or adapt to their unique environment, their unique community, their unique way of being? Okay. And so that's kind of what we're looking at when we're looking at cross-cultural development or cross-cultural studies. And so just on a general basis, I want us all to think about what are we looking at? What specific areas are we looking at when we're looking at human growth and development in general? And it's represented by this Venn diagram. And you'll notice that these components overlap to some degree. Because the first one is we look at biological processes. So when we look at biological processes, we're looking at the growth of the biological system over time, meaning the development of the nervous system, the development of physical growth in those aspects of our biological system. Okay. And as I have mentioned in this class before, what makes humans unique when compared to most, not all species on Earth, is that when it comes to biological processes, humans are not born with a fully developed biological system, especially a fully developed neurological system. When most species are born, they're born with a fully developed brain. They're born with a fully developed nervous system, which makes them prepared from the beginning to start to react to environmental contingencies. So really, when most species are born, they're born with the ability to mimic right away. They're built with the ability to be able to be mobile, be able to eat on their own, be well to some degree. They're able to warm themselves, cool themselves, even though that there is some degree of parental involvement in those situations. Even when we think of birds, they're taught to fly at a very early age, and they don't necessarily need to learn how to do that. There's a certain point of time where the mom birds or the dad birds just kind of kick them out of the nest, and all of a sudden they're at flight. They don't have to learn that process. It becomes to them naturally at a certain point of time. Okay. For humans, on the other hand, and a few other species, we're born with a severely undeveloped brain. In fact, 90% of our brain develops between the age of 0 to 6. And that means that humans are raised not in the biological warmth of the mother, but in the socio-cultural context of the world. Okay. And that's where our brain develops. Hence, we are very dependent upon culture and social processes to determine what behaviors we should commit, what behaviors are important, what emotions we need to admit in order to respond to our environment. They're not something that are inborn to us. Okay. Moving along, socio-emotional processes again overlap with these biological processes as we learn about the expectations of culture, the expectations of our social world. But when we talk about socio-emotional processes, we're talking about the connections we make with one another, because the one thing we know about human beings is that we are a social being. If we were born with a fully developed brain, we would probably be more like bees and ants, because we would have this pre-programmed social expectation of us, and we would follow that pre-programmed process. Okay. But we're not. We're born with underdeveloped brains, so our socialness is developed through the culture and society that we're raised in, and the social environment that we're raised in, which develops us to be more adaptive than a lot of other species. This is why you can almost find human beings on living and inhabiting most of the world, but we definitely take advantage of the entire world. So we have a lot of people doing scientific explorations in the South and North Poles and extreme conditions. People who climb 20, 30,000 feet mountains and those kinds of things, um, but not necessarily inhabit them. Um, so just to point out is humans are a social being. We've proven this through uh, uh, experiments that the Nazis did during World War II. We've shown this with social neuroscience. And so I'm not gonna press this much more, but we have to realize that we are a social being. We can't exist without other people. And our social cultural processes, if you think about them, are a social process. So they're a socialization process. All right. And then we add on to this the way we think about our world, which are cognitive processes, our memories, our emotions about how we think and feel about the world, our decision-making ability, our ability to combine past experiences with current experiences to determine what our current behavior should be. Okay. And these are cognitive processes. So as we know, most human beings, as we'll see here in a moment, develop cognitively very similar, but the time periods in which they develop and to which developmental period they will most be adaptive to is dependent upon the environment and the culture that they're raised in. Okay. So think of these as a dynamic process and an interactive process. And that's what we study when we study change over time. Okay, so for just a few minutes, I want to get into research methods and how do these cross-cultural psychologists really study culture and culture similarities and cultural differences. And the first uh, process is what's called cross-culture comparative studies. And these studies involve comparing individuals or groups from different cultures on various aspects of development, such as cognition, socio-emotional development, or behavioral development across cultures. Now, this is not necessarily a method. This is kind of a philosophy, okay? And so when we talk about this is kind of a system of comparison. The way we go about it is through things like field studies and cross-cultural surveys. So field studies are when a researcher conducts observational or ethnographic studies in the naturalistic settings with different cultures by observed or documented developmental processes. And this allows the researcher to gain insight into cultural practices. That first chapter that I want you to read out of Compartment is what we call field studies, that then use the person's naturalistic observations about before Western alcohols were introduced and after Western alcohols were introduced. And then they do cross-cultural comparative studies. And I think you will find the studies very interesting. Um, Especially for this section, I really want you all to read at the end of that chapter. There is two comparisons between two cultures. They're South American indigenous tribes, where one parenting approach is to be very off with their children. In fact, they're actually, if you want to think,
Psychology and culture class.
they're kind of bullies, in a sense, to their children, and that's their way of raising those children. In the other culture, they're very nurturing. In fact, the child is seen as the prize of the community that should be nurtured and cared for and taken care of. And the purpose of that comparison between parenting is they both, before Westernization, drank similar native spirits, native alcohols, as she would say. And then after colonization, after Westernization, they also drank similar Westernized drinks. And you will see that the effects of those changes had differences on each of those communities based upon the way the culture parented those children. So pay attention to those. I think they're like the second to third last comparison that is done in that chapter. Okay. The other approach, which has been becoming very popular, and we'll have an example here at the end of the lecture if we get to it, of China. And this is a within culture, if you want to put it this way, a within culture comparison, where psychologists and anthropologists and the like do surveys between different cultures, and then they do statistical analysis to see the similarities and differences between those cultures. And we will see, maybe by the end of this lecture, that using these survey methods, for example, in China, they have 54 different regions. They don't necessarily, like here in the United States, call them states, but there's 54 distinct regions within China. And what these psychologists found using cross-cultural survey methods is that each of these different 54 different regions have different developmental trajectories for the children dependent upon the unique culture and the unique socialization of children in all 54 of these different regions. And so development within China, which I think everyone would think that they're what we call a nationalist state, meaning that everything is aimed towards the nation, not necessarily to the local needs or the local needs of the community. But what this survey found is that that each of these unique developmental trajectories for children have nothing to do with the nationalist political ideology of China, but has to do with each unique region within China. And so it'll be an example of cross-cultural surveys. All right. Experimental studies, this involves manipulation with variables. So when we talk about experimental studies, what we're trying to determine is cause and effect. And so what we're trying to determine is whether one variable uh, causes the change in another variable. The variable we think causes a change is called the independent variable. The variable that we think is being changed is the dependent variable. So in an experimental study, the way you determine cause and effect is you manipulate the independent variable. So you put it to different degrees to see if it has different effects on the independent variable. So this is not a cross-cultural example, but for example, in my dissertation, I did an experimental study, and you'll probably remember this example from when we went through social identity theory, because one of the studies plus other studies that were done after that supported this notion is that in my dissertation, what I did was an experimental study where I manipulated identity to see if it had an effect on loneliness. And so there were actually four conditions, but as I said in the presentation on identity, the two experimental conditions was social identity, where we asked in the first study we asked students what are um, uh, best qualities or the best qualities of being a college student. In the other condition, which is more of the control condition, we asked, what are your personal best qualities or your personal identity qualities? And then we gave a measure of loneliness, and we found that individuals who think about their own uniqueness were almost twice as lonely or three times as lonely as individuals who thought of their identity as it is identified with a group. Okay, that's an example of an experimental study. So from that study, we know identity causes a change in loneliness. Okay. And so that's an example. And so when we do this from a cross-cultural perspective, is we do the same experimental manipulation with one culture and then do the same one with another culture and see if it has the similar or different effects. Okay. And we'll provide some examples of this coming Monday, because it gets very more specific when we're comparing just two specific cultures. Because with experimental studies, they're very expensive to do. And so usually when we're doing an experimental study in cross-cultural psychology, we usually are only limited to two cultures. Okay. Longitudinal studies, which is really the hallmark of human development studies, is measuring the same people over time. Okay. So in this instance, when we're talking about cross-cultural studies, we're taking the same age group in two cultures, and we're measuring the same variable between those two cultures, and we're seeing if those variables change the same or if they change differently. Excuse me. And the best example of this is when we get to cognition. We'll see, for example, with something known as Piaget's cognitive model, where we measure the different Piagetian methods of understanding different stages of cognition, that the stages are pretty much consistent across cultures, but the time in which individuals go through those stages are different, and what stage they'll get to is different as well, but we'll get to that in just a little while. Right. I do want to go back to the field study example because I mentioned it in the reading that you're going to do, that it compares two indigenous communities within a field study parameter. But I do want to mention that this field study method, especially among sociologists, is used to study subcultures. So I think I mentioned it in this class, and if you've taken some of my other classes, I have mentioned this. But another good example of field studies is the examination of intercity gangs. Um, and the sociologist, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was this very white middle class guy, and so this is a difficulty about doing field study that I just want to bring this up. And he wanted to really get into and figure out what is the processes of intercity gangs. And so what he did is he moved to a very inner city place where there was competing inner city gangs. He moved there, and in the first while, he just got to know the community, and he integrated or assimilated into that community until he started to build trust with those gangs. And then he started talking with them and gained their trust. And that's when he started then to say, hey, I'm a sociologist. I want to know what your community is like. And they were very open with it. And the interesting thing we learned from that, and I think I've mentioned this before, is that inner city gangs are structured almost exactly like corporations like Apple and Microsoft, and is that they have a CEO, then they have the vice presidents, and he actually even mentioned that there was one time he went and visited this one inner city gang, and they actually had the organizational chart on the wall about who is who. But I just wanted to bring this example up because these field studies are also used to study cultures within cultures. Okay, I just wanted to bring that up really quick. And also more on a micro level, we also use mixed methods approach. And the best example that I can use with mixed methods approach is when I did organizational assessments. So long ago, if you've read my bio, my master's degree is in industrial organizational psychology. And the thing that I was hired is I was hired by nonprofits to come in. They were having difficulties. Making they weren't making their goals. They weren't making their grant goals or whatever it may be. They were just having huge problems, and they'd have me go in and do assessment and try and figure out what is going on. And there was this mid-sized hospital. It was a nonprofit hospital who was considering investing. I mean, we're almost talking almost millions, maybe around a $500,000 into these employee training programs, because they were having an incredible amount of turnover and employees not performing very well. And they were almost on the brink of closing down, even though it was in a very high need, low income area. They were just not meeting the needs of the community. But before they did that, they decided to bring in the low income nonprofit a consultant, and try and figure out what's going on. So this is the mixed method approach in this culture, in this micro culture of this hospital. Is what I did is I went in, and the first thing I did was a quantitative assessment. I did an assessment of employee satisfaction, employee burnout, employee commitment to the organization. And I did this quantitative analysis of this. And I found these pockets where there was huge amounts of burnout, job dissatisfaction, and low commitment to the organization. But that's not what I focused on. What I focused on is individuals who had low job satisfaction, but high organizational commitment. All right. And then this is where the qualitative method came in within this inner cultural of a business organization. Is I went and interviewed two groups. I interviewed the individuals who scored high in burnout, high in dissatisfaction, and high in non commitment to the organization. And then I went and interviewed the people with um, high organizational commitment, but low job satisfaction. Okay. And in the end, within this organization, instead of paying almost $500,000 in these training programs, all they needed to do was fire three people within this organization of about 200. Okay. And I said, if you fire those three people, you'll see your situation improve. And so that's what they did. And over the next 6 months, their job satisfaction, their job performance, their turnover rates greatly reduced. Okay. Because within this community, what I found using what's called a mixed methods approach is that there were basically three people within the organization that were completely committed to the organization, but they were very dissatisfied with their work. And they blamed that dissatisfaction on their work on other employees. And so what they would do is someone new came into the organization and those three individuals didn't like that person. They would triangulate that person to make them completely miserable, make their job completely miserable, and make it so that person would instantly leave or leave within at least the first 3 months of their employment because they thought it was the other people making their job so miserable. Um, and so the recommendation was to fire those three people, and the organization's culture has been stable. I disconnected with them around 13 years ago, but about 5 years after I stopped kind of following up with them, 5 years after, they were still very stable. They still had good organization. Okay, that's an example of how you use mixed methods to help a microculture. But again, when we're talking about cultural differences and cultural similarities on a cross-cultural basis, we're using this method not only to see what the objective experiences of people are, but what the lived and real experiences of people are. So the quantitative gives us an objective picture, what's going on within those cultures and comparing those two cultures. The qualitative part of it is it gives the lived experiences of the individuals living within that culture or those two cultures that we're going to compare. Okay. Oh, I just noticed that we're almost out of time. So I know you find all this analysis stuff exciting. I do. Um, I'm one of those weirdos that when I'm having bad days, I go find a whole bunch of data and I analyze it. But I'm one of those weirdos. So I'm going to end with today. I know we're right on time. Is there any questions about the content that we've went over today? As far as introducing what we're talking about development and the different methods of research that psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists use. Is there any questions before I let you all go? Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Angelica. All right, Lorraine, All right, applying. All right. All right. All right. Thank you, Summer. Okay, gang, let's go ahead and get out of here for today. As of right now, tentatively, Monday is canceled. But if anything changes, I will let you know due to Professor Camillus Lopez's funeral, which is scheduled for Sunday and Monday. But unless something changes, I'll let you all know through Canvas announcement. Okay. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for coming. And take care of yourselves.